what makes a decision Islamic? What makes anything Islamic? As a scholar of religion and as a scholar of Islam, I would tell you is that every decision a Muslim makes is an Islamic decision. What I mean by that is I'm trying to kind of poke at the discourse that there is Islam and then there are what Muslims do, and that you can separate the Islamic tradition from what Muslims do. And I adopt a particular kind of intellectual framework that does not distinguish between the two. Welcome everyone, it is your host Iman, and today I'm feeling particularly grounded in the objective. And what I mean by that is I was recently asked by somebody, how do you not give yourself the ick by posting on social media, by sharing what you think? And it made me reflect on a moment of when I decided I was going to basically start posting on social media, when I decided I was going to start this podcast. And what I came up with through also trial and error was getting really specific on what my objectives were. I had essentially come to the realization that using my social media as both a display of kind of my like personal and social life, as well as using it as an academic platform, I used to feel okay about crossing over those things. And then I realized with time that I actually didn't feel okay about that. A part of that had to do with getting doxxed and having some strange messages where I thought, okay, I am somebody who is putting academic and scholarly research and thoughts and intellectual work out there and my opinions out there that I realize can sometimes receive negative backlash. And I actually don't want any of my family or friends associated with that negative backlash. So I had a few instances where I thought, okay, I'm actually not going to post my friends and family on my page anymore because my page isn't just primarily about my life and what I'm up to. And so once I realized that I was okay with like not actually having my social media be a real depiction of my actual social life, that was step one. But then step two was also getting extremely clear on like what did I need to prioritize above all else that was going to make me feel okay about hitting that post button. And what I came up for myself was that it doesn't matter what I'm doing in the video, as long as it has a particular kind of learning objective. So it might be a video of me getting ready and doing my makeup in the morning, but voiced over that video is going to be me inviting you into a scholarly conversation, giving you my thoughts on pedagogy and teaching. So as long as the video is accompanied with a clear kind of learning takeaway, then I can get over my own ick of posting myself and having myself be out there. And I realized that once I got really grounded in that objective, that I use social media as a learning platform, that I use social media as an extension of my classroom and got really clear on that objective, then I all of a sudden it felt very fickle to not put learning out there just because I didn't like the way that I looked in this one video, or I didn't think that I said that as well as I could have, or what have you. So having a really clear objective on what I was trying to do and what I was trying to say made me feel so much better, because it can feel so cringy to kind of post yourself and be vulnerable in that way. But also another experience that really made me get over that, even me saying, oh my gosh, it can feel so cringy to post yourself and what have you, is talking with younger people and realizing that one of the reasons why they don't talk in class is because they also feel like it's cringe. In that moment, I was like, wait, since when did sharing your thoughts after engagement with a particular kind of text, after thinking with a particular kind of conversation, become cringe? And I realized I was internalizing a mindset that I was actively trying to get my students to move away from. And I was trying to get them to move away from it in the classroom, but also me thinking about my social media as an extension of my own classroom, as trying to bring my scholarship, my pedagogy, my intellectualism, my teaching to a much broader public than those who can afford to be in my classes. I realized I also had to kind of get up out of my own internalization that being not just a voice, but being a voice with a face, and being a voice with a particular kind of Black femme aesthetic and face, I needed to get over my own kind of cringe. So getting clear on that objective, getting clear on the fact that I use social media as a extension of my classroom and not necessarily a scrapbook of my life, having that clarity really helped me feel grounded in what I'm doing. It made me feel like I actually can post every day, because I know that every single one of my posts, I hope that people people are walking away with learning something and teaching something. And why would I keep that to myself when the whole point of me getting this degree has been to share this knowledge? So all that to say is, every time I get on here, every time that I sit behind this microphone or post something, I'm able to get out of my own head and feel grounded in the objective. So I guess this is another way of saying that there's so much grounding when you do the kind of self-exploration and self-reflection to know what your why is. Why are you doing this? Why are you posting this? Why do you want people to see this? Why do you want to be in front of people? Why do you want an audience? Why do you want impact? And for me, I truly believe that learning about the concepts and the ideas in Black studies, religious studies, gender studies, in that kind of academic spaces that I'm in, I think that everybody should have access to, because I do think it's life-changing, it's perspective-changing. And in saying this out loud, I'm actually feeling reminded in this moment that getting clear on the why helps you also get out of your own way and get out of your own fears, because I've been, as you can tell, my background is very different. I brought some of my lights with us, but books that are on this bookshelf are not mine. I'm staying in a place over the summer because I'm doing archive research in New York, and last week was my first week and had such a great time. And one day wasn't so successful, but then the other day was. And that's just kind of the nature of archival research. And while I've been here, I've been thinking, wow, I really want to do something that is a public free event here in New York, and that is in person. I do a ton of virtual events with different kinds of organizations, and where I've given free lectures and free talks. And I just thought I really want to do something like related to Grounded, related to this kind of public intellectual profile, and have like a Prof in the Park event where I do something in Prospect Park. I've been writing about a particular kind of Black nationalist history, and one of the kind of scenes in this Black nationalist history happens in Brooklyn, in New York. And I thought, wow, I really would love to be able to tell that story and have that kind of conversation while I'm here. And so I came up with this idea like, oh, I kind of want to do this thing called Prof in the Park, where I give this sunset golden hour lecture. It's free. People bring a blanket, they bring a friend, they bring their curiosity. And there's been something inside of me that has felt just a little bit, I'm not quite sure, like a little scared to do it, a little vulnerable. I'm like, will people even show up? It's like, if I throw a party, will people even come? And I'm realizing now that actually I need to recommit myself to the objective, which is bringing scholarly conversations to the public. And a part of that also has to be like public physical spaces. That's ultimately what I want: in-person gatherings and in-person intellectual conversations to be a part of Grounded. And I keep telling myself, I'm tired of waiting. Oh, I need to have this many listeners, or I need to have this many people or things, when I just want to do it now. I want to build and live and do the things that I want to do now. And it feels totally scalable to do like one in New York in July and one in August. So I actually am 100% going to be doing it. I even made a poster to force myself to commit to this and actually bring this into reality. And just sitting here reflecting on this question of somebody asking me like, oh, how do you post on social media without feeling cringe? And me saying, well, I post because my objective is really clear. My objective is to bring scholarly conversations and conversations that are typically reserved to the classroom to the public, so I can get out of my own way and I can get out of my own kind of self-centeredness of feeling cringe about myself, knowing that my job is to teach, and this is a teaching and a learning objective for me, is to have these kinds of conversation. And not just like a teaching and a learning objective, but it's also a purpose objective for me. And it's making me think, girl, you need to be telling yourself the same thing about this Prof in the Park first in-person solo kind of coordinated event that you want to do, because you need to put the objective over your fear that people are not going to come or show up, or people will think it's silly or what have you. So you want to know what? Look at that. That's me to me right there. That's my higher self to my lower self. So follow me on social media and definitely be on the lookout for that. I'm going to be doing that at the end of July in Prospect Park, and just, yeah, we'll have a good free little lecture on a history of Black spirituality. And I think it could be really cool. So anyways, all that to say is I'm going to feel grounded in that objective, even if I am worried that nobody will come to my party. But you know what? If there is an affirmation that people are actually out there listening, is the fact that we have a listener question today. And it comes from Yasmin from Canada. Thank you so much for sis for sending this in. And she wrote me and she said, I would love to hear your thoughts on Black Muslims making Islamic decisions. So Yasmin, thank you for this question. It is a great one. And one thing as an academic and as a scholar, we love to think about both an answer to the question, but also how even the framing and the asking of the question itself sparks its own conversation. So before I get into a moment in Black Muslim history and contemporary kind of Muslim discourses and contemporary Islamic studies scholarship that I think is a really good example of this is particularly the work of Dr. Amina Wadud, who wrote the first woman-centered interpretation of the Quran. I actually want to take a step back and just think about this question as a question in and of itself. And it's asking your thoughts on Black Muslims making Islamic decisions, which actually begs the question of what makes a decision Islamic? What makes anything Islamic? And as a scholar of religion and as a scholar of Islam, I would tell you, and how I come at it, is that every decision a Muslim makes is an Islamic decision. And I would tell you that every decision a Black Muslim makes is an Islamic decision. And when I say that, every decision that a Black Muslim makes is an Islamic decision, or any decision that a Muslim makes is an Islamic decision. What I mean by that is I'm trying to kind of poke at the discourse that there is Islam and then there are what Muslims do, and that you can separate the Islamic tradition from what Muslims do. And I adopt a particular kind of intellectual framework that does not distinguish between the two. And that framework is thinking about Islam as a lived religion. And when folks think about any religion as a lived religion, whether it be Christianity, Islam, Judaism, what they're trying to get at is that Islam has always been a lived religion. It's always been a tradition in which people are trying to make sense of revelation, right? They're trying to make sense of the discourses, the legal frameworks, the scriptures, the jurisprudence, the hermeneutics, the interpretations of things that have come before them as it relates to their contemporary lives. So as a scholar of religion, when I think of this, I do not draw any distinction between Islam and Muslims. Islam is what Muslims make of it. Islam is what Muslims say it is. Islam is a living tradition that is constantly informed by people's social realities, political economies, things of the past, authority, power, a very kind of complex tradition, and isn't just one thing that exists absent of the people who are in conversation with it. It's a constant meaning-making process. So that is what I would summarize to you as like a lived religion approach to Islam. And a lived religion approach being that all religion is lived. And one scholar who I think is actually really useful for thinking about this is a scholar named Shahab Ahmed. And he has this book called What is Islam? That is really important to this conversation in terms of thinking about Islam as being what Muslims make of it, and thinking about this idea that what makes something Islamic isn't necessarily its adherence to a particular set of norms and a particular kind of cohesive one way of doing things. Actually, what makes something Islamic is the way that people make meaning out of revelation, and that meaning is constantly mediated by the complexity of their lived lives, by their socio-historical and socio-political context. It's a huge tome. It's like a 600-page book. And again, it's this big generalized question. What is Islam? What makes something Islamic? And he charts all of the contradictions that have come up in Islamic philosophy and Islamic theology and interpretations of scripture, even all of the contradictions that have been about things that are highly controversial, that people think that there is only one way of interpreting, even things like drinking wine, for example. There has been huge contradictions on what are the exact stipulations of how much wine somebody can drink, if drinking is haram halal in any case, or some jurisprudence has said you can drink as much wine as long as you're able to like stand up. So in this book, he takes these very controversial issues, right? And he charts how there has never been one single unified way of making meaning out of revelation in order to answer a single question, whether it be drinking, whether it be anything else. He wants us to see that the Islamic tradition is made up of contradiction, that in fact, actually what coheres it is the fact that there is so much contradiction in it. And so what he means by this, that there's a kind of coherence in the contradiction, this is kind of like a complex idea, but what he is saying is that the Islamic tradition has never meant one thing. So if the Islamic tradition has never meant one thing, then how do we know and how do we determine when something is or isn't Islamic, right? This is a big question for scholars, for people who think about Islam, for Muslims, for followers, practitioners of it. How do you determine if something is Islamic or not? What makes my dress Islamic versus somebody else's dress not Islamic? And what Shahab Ahmed wants us to think about is to think about Islam as a meaning-making process. It is a dynamic system of meaning-making in which people try to make sense of their everyday lives, of the things that are right in front of them in conversation with revelation, right? So he's saying, as long as I am in conversation with revelation, I'm going to have a particular kind of outcome. Maybe I'm trying to read this particular verse on Muslims' relationship to nature, and I'm trying to decide, is it Islamic to compost? Or is it not Islamic to compost? Based on who they are, their intellectual trajectories, where do they know from, and the meaning that they derive from revelation, from scripture, from interpretations that are before them, right? People are going to have different answers to that question. Is it Islamic to not compost? Is it Islamic to not recycle? They're going to have different answers to that question. And so what Ahmed wants us to see through this framework is that what makes something Islamic is the fact that people are in conversation about it, and that there's always contradictions in what people associate what decisions with Islam and others that are not. And that there's always going to be contradiction in how people make sense of revelation, of their lived lives, of what they think is Islamic and what is not Islamic. So he does this massive history of all the contradictions that have risen within the Islamic legal, theological, and intellectual tradition to show that there has never been just one thing that is Islamic. So what he would say to the question is, well, what is an Islamic decision? It would be that any decision that somebody's making where they're in conversation with the tradition, with revelation, is an Islamic decision. Whether or not they decide to say yes to something that somebody would say no to, or say no to something that somebody in the past has said yes to, the fact that they are in negotiation and trying to make sense of their lives and make sense of this decision in relation to the tradition, it doesn't really matter if they come out on a yes or a no, it's still an Islamic decision. So that can feel kind of confusing when you think about it, because often, right, we want to have kind of black and white answers to things like, yes, this is Islamic if you do it this way, but it's not Islamic if you do it that way. When in reality, what Ahmed invites us to do is really sit in the ambiguity that any decision a Muslim makes where they're in conversation with this particular tradition, when they're trying to figure out what it means to live a life as Muslim, when they're trying to figure out what it means to be Muslim, any decision that they come out with is going to be an Islamic decision, because Islam has never cohered around a particular set of norms or ethics. There hasn't ever only been one kind of Islam. The beauty of the tradition is that there is this contradiction, but even within the contradiction, we can still recognize and point out that there is something about this tradition that we recognize when we see it. And so people want, like I said, a very black and white understanding of being like, this is Islamic art, and this isn't Islamic art, or this is an Islamic decision, and this is an Islamic decision. When again, as a scholar of religion, and where in the camp that I'm coming from, is that any decision that Muslims make in conversation with the tradition, regardless if they decide to abide by something that is normally not abided by, if they contradict something that they themselves didn't grow up in, those are all still Islamic decisions, because they are people making meaning in conversation with the tradition. So again, I promise I'm going to get to your question on you wanting to hear my thoughts on Black Muslims making Islamic decisions, but I also just want to keep probing this. So we just probed the idea of like what even makes a decision Islamic. And before we get into kind of thoughts on Black Muslims making Islamic decisions, I just want to take a second to also meditate on this idea that there are Black Muslims and then that there are Islamic decisions. And I want to add this element of how Islamic decisions and what is or isn't considered Islamic, or who is and isn't considered Muslim, is also a highly racialized and a highly gendered conversation. So there's an amazing scholar called Dr. Kayla Wheeler, and she has this term called Hegemonic Islam. She talks about how in our contemporary moment, Islam is associated with particular kind of ethnic and cultural articulations and productions where people who are considered to be Arab, who are considered to be Middle Eastern, who are considered to be South Asian, right? These are even colonial terms in of themselves. But when folks in cultural practices are privileged as being more Islamic than others, whereas other practices like Black Muslim cultural practices or Black cultural practices in America, point blank period, are then considered to not be Islamic. So when we think about Islamic decisions, we also have to account that in this contemporary world where Orientalism, Arab centrism, and Islamophobia define who and what we consider Muslims and who and what we consider a part of Islam, that when we close our eyes and think about Islam or what is an Islamic decision, we often have a particular person in mind. That person is typically male, that person is typically speaking Arabic, that person has a particular kind of gendered presentation. And so what her term hegemonic Islam invites us to consider is that there are certain genders and there are certain races, there are certain languages, there are certain cultural practices that are privileged as being more Islamic than others that does not actually map on to the demographics of who Muslims are. For example, the history of Islam in America. People think that Islam in America, a true representation of it might be an Arabic-speaking community, when in reality, the first Muslims in America were slaves, were Black Muslims. So we can think about how a particular kind of cultural affiliation to what Islam is also does not actually map onto a history of Islam in America. So what the term hegemonic Islam invites us to think about is how there's particular kind of gendered and racialized essentialization that makes certain groups of people seem more Islamic than others. And that kind of distinction of who gets to be seen as authoritative legitimately or easily identifiable as Muslim or something that is easily identifiable as Islamic often reproduces particular kinds of racial and gendered hierarchies. And what Dr. Wheeler's concept also points out is that in those kinds of framework, Black Muslim women always bear the brunt and are seen as being the least Islamic people because their gender and race are not a part of a hegemonic construction of Islam, a reducible kind of essentialist Orientalist understanding of Islam as only being, as colonizers put it, the religion of the East, right? So when my students ask me, what is Islam? What makes something Islamic? I always try to probe with them the real complexity of the fact that, well, we have to account for the fact that when we close our eyes, political imaginaries, racial and gender hierarchies determine who and what we consider Islamic. But also when we ask what is Islam, we're assuming that there's a kind of coherence, a kind of one thing that we can point to that Islam has always been, when scholars show us consistently, like in the book, What is Islam, that actually the Islamic tradition has never been formulated around coherence. There's always been contradiction. There's always been debate. And if anything, what it shows us is that things last, things live on when there is contradiction and when there is debate. So now that I've kind of gone on this tangent of what even is an Islamic decision, and we've settled the framework of an Islamic decision is a decision that any Muslim makes in terms of trying to make meaning between their life and their lived experience and revelation and the Islamic tradition. So what makes something an Islamic decision is not necessarily the outcome of that decision, what they do or don't decide to do. What makes something an Islamic decision is a Muslim engaging the tradition, engaging revelation, engaging the people and things that have been said before them, and trying to make meaning out of that. There has never been one meaning, but there's always been a conversation. And it's the conversation that they are facilitating between their lived lives and scripture and the tradition that makes something Islamic. That is how I understand it as a scholar of Islam and as a scholar of religion. And I don't come to that decision out of nowhere. I come to that decision by reading folks who take a lived religion approach, by coming from this decision based off of my own mentors, of reading books like What is Islam? And then at the same time, as somebody who studies Black Muslim history and Black Muslima history, I'm also particularly attuned to the way in which decisions that are often made and affiliated with Black Muslims and Black Muslim women are often seen as non-Islamic decisions, right? That there's a particular kind of gendered and racialized hierarchy that makes some people as being seen as more representative of a quote unquote more authentic Islam than others. So whenever I think about Islam, right, I'm always attending to the way that some people are lifted up over others. I'm always trying to be attentive to the fact that there is no singular, hegemonic, universal understanding of the tradition, that there's always been contradiction in the tradition. So part of understanding Islamic decisions is being able to hold on to complexity and hold on to the gray. So to get back to Yasmin beautifully asking me my thoughts on Black Muslims making Islamic decisions, I almost felt like overwhelmed when I first heard it, because I was like, wow, there's so many decisions to pick from, right? When you are somebody who comes from a framework of seeing every decision that a Black Muslim makes in conversation with the tradition as being an Islamic decision, it's like, wow, like how do we narrow down some? But I am an intellectual historian, so I'm always thinking about particular kinds of thinkers and the decisions that they make. And you can't think about Black Muslimas making Islamic decision without thinking about the Dr. Amina Wadud. Dr. Amina Wadud is a scholar and professor emeritus of Islamic studies. She's famously known for writing the first woman-centered interpretation of the Quran. She is an incredible scholar, and she's also known for leading a mixed congregation prayer as a woman and as being one of the foundational foremothers of what folks call Muslima theology. And one of her most important contributions to contemporary Islamic thought, Islamic theology, is her concept of the Tawhidic Paradigm, which in and of itself is actually a decision-making paradigm. When I thought about a Black Muslim making Islamic decisions, I of course thought of Amina Wadud and the fact that she actually offers Muslims, Muslim women, Black Muslims, a framework of making decisions for themselves that are Islamic that might contradict norms and what has been decided in the past. And so to give some context on where the Tawhidic paradigm comes into, what is the conversation it is participating in? So Amina Wadud is a scholar who has been committed to gender justice and egalitarian interpretations of the Quran. And gender justice and gender egalitarian interpretations in which Muslim women are seen as full, agential, authoritative actors in participating in Muslim communities and the Islamic tradition, just as much as men are. She has done this work both organizationally, but she has also done this work theologically and intellectually in her woman-centered reading of the Quran and in her book called Inside the Gender Jihad, in which she expounds upon this idea of the Tawhidic paradigm. So what is the Tawhidic paradigm? It comes from the word Tawhid, which is divine oneness. This is the monotheistic core of Islam. What makes Islam monotheistic is the idea that there is only one God and that there is nothing that we encounter in creation and in this world that is above Allah, that is above the divine, that is above the creator. There's nothing that has a godlike status. And so what Amina Wadud brings into this conversation is she asks, well, if there is no one above God, why is it that men can lead prayer and lead women in prayer, but women cannot lead men in prayer? And so in 2005, she leads a woman-led prayer in New York City in front of a mixed congregation, as I've said. And this part of her career has kind of been sensationalized over other ones, but I think it's important to bring up here because it puts into practice and demonstrates in this very real way exactly what she means by the Tawhidic paradigm. So she says that if there is only one God and there is nothing above God, that putting anything above God undermines the monotheistic principles of Islam. Why is it that women cannot lead men in prayer, but men can lead women in prayer? She says that placing men as having more religious authority over women undermines the monotheistic core of Islam because it places men in a godlike status and above women. Again, fundamentally undermining the monotheistic core that says that there is nothing that is close to God or nothing that is godlike on this earth. So she says when men are given more religious authority over the tradition to determine what should and shouldn't be or what can and is possible, that the monotheistic core of Islam is undermined when women do not have the same ritual, interpretive, scriptural authority as men do. And so she calls this the Tawhidic Paradigm, that a true representation of the monotheistic principles of Islam would make it so that women, all people, have the same religious authority as anyone else. And so you can apply this to even thinking about why is it that certain languages are privileged as being more Islamic than others, right? If we put, for example, only Arabic-speaking Muslims as having more authority over the tradition, then we're also fundamentally undermining the monotheistic core of Islam in practice because we're saying that those people who speak that language have more authority over the tradition and are thus also placing them in a godlike status. So it's a big question of authority. But she comes up with this Tawhidic paradigm by saying that having gender injustice, any injustice in which one human is put above another, is undermining the monotheistic core of Islam. And she uses this paradigm as a framework for asserting women's authority in the tradition. And so this is a Black Muslim woman who is making an Islamic decision that says, I, as a Black Muslim woman, can lead other Muslims in prayer, including men. And I do that because I have a particular understanding of the Islamic concept of Tawhid that tells me that there should be nothing that undermines my authority and my ability to do anything within the tradition or puts me below anybody else. Because then if that is the case and I practice that and I believe that and I put that into practice more than we've talked about belief, but if I practice and live a life according to this idea that I do not have the same religious authority as somebody else or an entire group of people, women do not have the same religious authority as men, then I am actually not abiding by Islam because I am not following its most basic principle. And so she uses this Tawhidic paradigm to affirm her decision to lead mixed congregation prayer, to affirm her decision that she is authoritative over the tradition just as much as anybody else is. And so with this Tawhidic paradigm, Amina Wadud makes a huge contribution to a school of thought that has been named as Muslima theology. And so Aisha Hidayatullah has written about this concept of Muslima theology. I will link that in the show notes. And she's also written a book called Feminist Edges of the Quran, which I don't want to get too into the details of, but what I think is really important when we think about what it means to make Islamic decisions is thinking about that there are tons of different kinds of schools of thought. We know that there are different schools of law in Islam that have different methods for reaching a conclusion on what people should or shouldn't do or what an individual person should or should not do. And so one of those schools is Muslima theology. And there are certain kinds of principles that cohere their decision-making practice. And so some of those principles that Aisha Hidayatullah names out as being distinguishing of Muslima theology is Amina Wadud's Tawhidic paradigm. But another question that also the Muslima theologian, that Amina Wadud, that folks in this school of thought, is what happens when you disagree with something in scripture? What happens when you disagree with something that is the norm in the place or in the community that you're a part of? What happens when you disagree with what the text says and what the people are saying because you don't feel that interpretation produces the most just outcome or the most humane outcome or the outcome that is supportive of life more than anything else? Then what do you do in that moment? And so Amina Wadud is also a huge proponent that when it comes to making decisions about what should or shouldn't be considered Islamic, what should or shouldn't a Muslim community do, what should or shouldn't a Muslim do, what should we be supportive, what have you. And she also says sometimes you also just have to say no to the text. So again, this is her making an Islamic decision. When we think about Shahab Ahmed about what makes this decision Islamic, what makes it Islamic is the fact that she's in conversation with the tradition in the first place. She's in conversation with revelation in the first place. But in the outcome of that conversation is that she says that sometimes you also just have to say no to the text. Sometimes when a text is saying something that does not support the kind of vision for justice and egalitarianism that I want, maybe sometimes I don't have to make sense of why I would say that. There's lots of interpretive strategies that you can, but sometimes you just have to say no. Other strategies amongst Muslima theologians include historically contextualizing verses, particularly verses that have been historically used towards women's oppression, right? They say we have to historically contextualize those verses as not being evergreen or applicable across time and place. That is one of them. Another interpretive strategy, when they come across verses in the Quran or what have you, or in the tradition that do not cohere with what they feel like is an egalitarian and just world, is prioritizing the entire Quran, the entire message, the entire ethos of the Quran over particular verses, right? Because the Quran in and of itself is also a text that has contradiction within it. Certain parts of the Quran contradict other parts, right? So it's this constant meaning making process that we're doing to decide what is or what isn't Islam. And then another one that I just mentioned that Amina Wadud says is sometimes we also just have to say no, right? Sometimes one even has to just go as far as to not follow it. And so again, so we have this just saying no to the Quran and this Tawhidic paradigm. These are two decision-making frameworks that Amina Wadud gifts contemporary Muslim, gifts Muslima theology, gifts Black Muslim women and Muslim women in general, which she says that these are the kinds of interpretive frameworks that we need in order to have a gender egalitarian society. That if we want to strive towards gender egalitarianism, these are the kinds of decision-making frameworks that we're going to need. And so this is an example, right, of a Black Muslima making an Islamic decision. And she uses this to talk about what it would mean to have Islamic theological frameworks that are really supportive of single mothers. What would it look like to have Islamic theological frameworks that are supportive of women survivors, of victims of domestic abuse, in order for decisions that haven't been normally supported to be seen as Islamic decisions? And so when I'm asked, like, what do I think about Amina Wadud? What do I think about this Black Muslima woman, intellectual, theologian, brilliant scholar? What do I make of her making these Islamic decisions? Well, I think what Amina Wadud is doing in terms of being in conversation with the tradition, in terms of meaning making with the tradition, I would say that she is doing what Muslims have always done, and that is contributing to what Islam is. Islam isn't just one thing. Islam is what Muslims do. Islam is the conversation and the meaning making that Muslims have between themselves, their lived realities, their particular historical context, in the tradition itself. And the tradition itself is always being constantly remade in conversation, right? So Amina Wadud is a part of the reason why the Islamic tradition is going to continue in the future, because that is how a tradition persists, by people being in constant conversation with it and constant meaning making. And Amina Wadud is one scholarly, big intellectual example. But anytime I as a Muslim wake up and I'm trying to decide, for example, what are my ethics going to be in my scholarship? What are my ethics going to be in my classroom? And I'm thinking about that in relation to revelation. I'm thinking about that in relation to the tradition. I'm thinking about that about what I've read in the tradition, what I've been told in the tradition. Those are all Islamic decisions, regardless of what I decide to do, whether or not what I decide to do continues the thing that I've been taught, whether what I decide to do really turns away from or changes direction from what I've been taught or what is the norm, right? Because I am saying that every decision that a Muslim makes is an Islamic decision. But again, thinking about hegemonic Islam, some decisions and some people are seen as more Islamic than others. That is a reality. So any decision that I make, whether or not I'm in affirmation of or turning away from what is considered a hegemonic part of Islam, any decision that any Black Muslim makes that is either continuing what is a kind of hegemonic normative understanding of what Islam is, or is really turning away from it, regardless, those are Islamic decisions, because an Islamic decision is one that is in conversation with the tradition, because the tradition has never just been one thing. There isn't just one Muslim or Islamic way of being. And to me, I find real grounding and I find real beauty in that complexity. A spiritual question that I always ask myself is, why do people want simplicity so much when a part of the beauty of human intellectualism is being able to hold on to complexity and being able to understand contradiction. Imagine if we weren't capable of understanding contradiction. Life would be way simpler. Life would lose its beauty. Life would lose its meaning. So having the intellectual capacity to hold on to complexity is a blessing, is beautiful. Almost every religious tradition that you engage with has something to the effect of the idea that discernment, that intellectualism is a gift, is a blessing, is a part of accessing the divine and the significance of this world. So to me, it's like, okay, why would anybody want to make something more simplistic rather than embrace the complexity of it? So I am leaving this conversation today just feeling very grounded and very thankful to Yasmin for this question that brought up so many thoughts and so many questions. I hope, sis, that I answered it. I hope that you enjoyed this conversation and what I was able to put forward for everyone. I'm putting everything in the show notes and all the readings that I mentioned. And today, you know what? I'm actually feeling a lot of grounding in that holding on to complexity is so hard. That's actually like something that I'm like struggling even in this moment to hold on to. But I think holding on to the complexity is also how you frequently get closure about things. This is going to sound a little cryptic, but I'm thinking about moments where things hurt you. People hurt you. Conversations hurt you. Things you read in books hurt you. Things you encounter in your workplace, in your tradition, your communities hurt you. And so for me personally, like as a triple earth sign and as a Capricorn, I can be very black and white and be like, okay, I'm cutting that person off. This is what it is. It's all good or it's all bad. When I have to also embrace the complexity, embrace the contradiction that people have good days, people have bad days. Communities have good moments, communities have bad moments. Traditions have moments that make my heart beam with joys. And then also I encounter in tradition moments that crush my soul, right? But there's a kind of complexity that we're always just going to be faced with, that things are never going to be as simple as they seem. And I think that there can be a lot of closure in that. I think there can be a lot of grounding in that. So that's very cryptic, but I hope that it provides relief to someone that, okay, maybe the point isn't always to have a black and white understanding, but to embrace complexity, even in moments when it is so hard, intellectually, spiritually, relationally, intimately, and what have you. So thank you all so much for being here with me today. I have a new background, which is going to just be another bait to tell you to please subscribe on YouTube. I really need those numbers up. To be on the lookout for the Prof in the Park event, I'm going to be doing one in July and one in August. So I'll be excited to share more details about that soon. Follow me at Iman ABDK, IMAN ABDK on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. Please, like Yasmin did, and I'm so grateful for that, Yasmin, Jazakallah khair, for being in conversation with me and giving us something to learn about today. I learned from your question today, and I'm really grateful for it. Anyone can send me a question, DM me, or you can send me an email at groundedwithdriman@gmail.com. So I hope you all have a wonderful, beautiful Monday, and I will see you here next week.